Okay, everybody, welcome. Any questions before we get going? All right, so we got probably a little over halfway through this chapter. The next one is pretty short and sweet, if I remember right. There's maybe a dozen slides or something on the next chapter. So wrap this guy up. The next chapter, what is this, 11? I think chapter 12 is the next one. We'll do that on Tuesday, and then the exam opens on Thursday. We'll do it like we have done before, and next Thursday we will not meet the class. I assume there are no objections with that. Okay, so there's a couple of things initially as we're looking at this image over here. This first one is a phylogenetic tree. It's a drawing that Darwin had made trying to depict speciation events, these family tree kind of ideas as we look at it, all right? And really kind of trying to wrap his head around the potentials for the diversification, right? There are, it's really kind of impressive to think about some of the thought process going into this. And as we think about things like natural selection, where species adapt to their respective environmental conditions, whatever they might be. Through this process of adaptation, one might think, and Darwin definitely did, that he thought that species should be marching toward perfection, toward some sort of betterness, yet then we look at all of the possibilities with other organisms in the same species that we're looking at. Some of them don't seem very fit. There's disease, there's illness, there's all sorts of problems. So it makes him throw his hands up and he's like, what in the heck is really going on here? Why aren't they all perfect? And natural selection doesn't drive populations toward perfection. It drives them to be better suited to their given conditions. And having variation within those populations lends to an enhanced likelihood of being able to adapt to change in the first place. So you technically need some of these things that may not be classified as the best conditions for this specific given circumstance, but maybe in a different situation, it might be an advantage, all right? And that definitely was something that Darwin had some difficulties kind of really trying to come to terms with, that, they aren't all driving toward perfection, if you will, whatever that might be, all right? So we can see with this elephant lineage over the course of millions of years, multiple speciation events, multiple branching points, and each of these little bits that we see on these trees where they branch off, we call those nodes. And that node indicates a speciation event. It indicates a point, maybe something measurable, oftentimes not, but a point in time where this population diversifies and we are no longer compatible, can't reproduce and create viable offspring. And at that point, they go off on their separate branches. They are different species, right? And each of these with potentials for other branchings to occur. Yes?
Is that kind of like a donkey and like a mule? So like a mule can't like reproduce or like.
So that is a great question, like a donkey and a mule. So the donkey and the horse can reproduce. The donkey and the horse create what we call a hybrid. The mule is sterile or infertile. So that mule, yes, it can have the donkey and mule can have, the donkey and horse, can have offspring, but the offspring can't reproduce. So we don't call that mule a new species. It's a hybrid. If it was able to reproduce, and if it could reproduce with itself and create more mules and doesn't reproduce with either parental population that generated it, donkeys or horses, then we'd be talking a different species, right? That would be something new and different, but that's not what we're seeing, you know, and there's numerous things that set the stage for some of those issues. It could be chromosome numbers. It could be differences in types of sperm and egg cells. Lots of it deals with chromosome numbers that prevent stuff from being generated in the first place. But a donkey and a horse chromosomally are super close. It's like one chromosome that's off, right? A different one chromosome number. And so they are able to be close enough that we could make a mule. But most things, if they were to breed together, typically it doesn't take. A goat and a sheep, as an example, usually you never have a hybrid that is born. There are some super rare circumstances where maybe that happens, but almost always when it does, that offspring, whatever you might call it, doesn't survive for very long, right? So there's also, you know, other issues with survivability that sets the stage for some of that, right? And so there's definitely potentials that prevent things like that. And then there are other opportunities where we might think about hybrids or possible fertile things that would lend to speciation events. There are definitely, when we shift away from thinking about mammals and maybe start thinking about plants, that's a little bit easier for things to manipulate and for new species to show up almost like overnight. This new flower or this new plant that had cross-pollinated with something different creates some seeds that are different, and the plant that grows up is distinct from the others, and that we would call a new species, right? A lot of the stuff as we look at this over the course of time, if we're thinking millions of years ago, 50 some odd million years ago, to our present day elephants that we think about today, we have two different, the Asian and the African elephant, right? There are similarities, but they are different. They are distinct. And if you were to bring these two together and try for them to reproduce, they would not. They are separate species, right? And even though they have some serious similarities, we can trace them back a considerable amount of time to see this diversification event, the speciation event, right? Where they're no longer compatible, right? There are numerous potentials for, as we start off on these separate branches, for each of these differing groups to start accumulating mutations, to start accumulating changes, variations within their genomes, that maybe if we were to come back, you know, right before this point, there's a lot of similarity that would allow for them to reproduce. And we got three different ones right here kind of all together. And then as mutations keep accumulating, that's when we start seeing incompatibility starting to show up and branching patterns that say these have diverged, right? And no longer are able to be reproductively compatible, right? And there are all sorts of potentials with this. And as we look at trees, it makes us think about some of this ancestry really in kind of in the first place. So here we've got a couple of spotted owls, the northern and the Mexican spotted owl. They bear some similarities. They look pretty similar, both owls, right? But they are different, right? And they are different species, even though we call them spotted owls, right? So they're in geographically separate or distinct regions, even though we see them both in North America. They inhabit completely different ranges, right? So the Pacific Northwest with the northern spotted, and Mexico Arizona, maybe a little bit of Texas, we see the Mexican spotted owl. So more desert-like and coastal, right? This is a temperate rainforest, really. Completely different types of habitats, right? So these, we would say, you know, and it could be the Rocky Mountains that are a separator. It's geographic distance that really kind of separates these guys. And when we think about geography, when we think about land masses, it could be separated by an ocean. It could be a crazy mountain range that does the separation. When there's some sort of environmental shift, that has a huge potential in driving change, driving speciation. We kind of think of it as different lands. We call that allopatric speciation for different areas, different fatherlands. That's really what the patric means. If it's the same area, if we were talking about owls right within this darker yellow bit, the Mexican spotted owl, the same sort of region, we would call that sympatric for same area, all right? And there are differences that we can see. That's kind of the horse and donkey creating a mule idea. In a sympatric, same area, all right, there are things like chromosomal issues that prevent that stuff. In allopatric, that stuff doesn't really even matter. It's the geography that separates them apart. Whether they've got close genetics or not really doesn't matter. The likelihood of them ever coming together is pretty much non-existent. Even though these birds, you might think, might be able to migrate to one area or the other, right? They don't. And even if they did, they don't reproduce, right? So they say here incipient speciation, where it's, you know, some sort of geography. We really kind of define that more like allopatric is what I'd like to call it in here, because that seems more fitting. We showed, what day is it? Tuesday. We showed Darwin and his finches. We showed a few of those finches and some of the variation that he saw on the Galapagos Islands. These honey creepers, it's the same idea, but a completely different island chain. So the honey creepers show up on the Hawaiian Islands, all right? And we get our founder species that makes it to these islands. And we've got a handful of islands, again, kind of untapped resources, if you will. These are the first bird species to make it to the Hawaiian Islands, all right? So the initial founder species is the one that makes it there. It brings with it, within its genome, and it's a handful of birds. It's not just one bird, right? It's a handful of birds that make it to this island, and they have some variation within their genomes. They all probably look pretty similar to this, but there is some variability, some heterozygosity, right? Dominant and recessive alleles carried within their genomes. And as they make it to these islands, we see all sorts of differences that start to show up within this new founder species of birds, all right? So we've got a handful up here. You can see the beaks there's some variation within them, what they're feeding on, nectar. These guys eat nectar, and they also tap into some insects. Down below, more insects, and then these guys eat insects, they eat seeds, and they'll even eat other bird eggs, right? The beaks are very different, and the foodstuffs are different as well. You can see other potential changes, maybe some changes in the plumage, although we're looking at a black and white photo. There's definitely some variation with this, right? So as this new species, this founder species makes it to an untapped resource, there is a possibility for adaptive radiations. It's the same thing that happened with the finches on the Galapagos Island. As they make it there from the mainland, there weren't other birds there, and they diversify, all right? I should have been on my game today and looked up some cactus, because, you know, right here in Idaho, we have all probably seen some prickly pear cactus, right? If you have not, I recommend you just take a quick trip right over by the greenhouse and you will see a handful of the native plants growing, and there's some prickly pear cactus all over right there. These are plants that might get about this tall if you've got some good moisture and stuff, or you're out in the middle of nowhere in the desert. You might find some of them that are a little bit bigger, all right? But usually not gigantic, right? Just kind of small little cactus, all right? Not like the gigantic saguaro cactus that you might see in Arizona that's huge, right? 100 feet tall or better. Craziness, right? Prickly pear cactus, we've all kind of got an idea of what these suckers look like, all right? On the Galapagos Islands, the prickly pear cactus was one of the first land plants to colonize on the island as well, all right? And just like the finches, where we see some crazy changes happening, there are prickly pear cactuses that are short like we think about, and there are prickly pear cactuses that are gigantic like a tree, right? Huge tree-like prickly pear cactus. Why? There weren't any trees there in the first place. And this cactus has variation within its genome that lent to some smaller variety and some larger variety. And they became these prickly pear cactus trees on these islands. That is pretty stinking awesome, right? When we look at other things that have shown up later, right, after things have already been there and started filling these niches, well, those species really aren't the founder species. They may be new colonists to these areas, but the new bird species that shows up, those other birds have already filled some of these potentials, and usually they remain very similar to their land dwelling versus the island dwelling counterparts. You don't see huge diversification. So other plant seeds start showing up and they don't have huge changes, or birds or whatever it might be, because the founder species is the one that's got that potential for adaptive radiations. After the dinosaurs went extinct 65 some odd million years back, we see a massive adaptive radiation that's kind of like what we think about here, seeing birds diversify, because a huge chunk of the genera get wiped out, right? There's all sorts of organisms that get annihilated, and some of the little fuzzy mammals that were able to persist all of a sudden have all of these untapped open resources, and we see a massive adaptive radiation after that point, where we see a huge change in the mammal lineages, because now these opportunities have presented themselves, right? Similar sort of an idea, all right? So there are other, while we see this right here, all right, it's not the same idea, all right, but thinking speciation types of events, all right? There are, and now I had the name of the bird just a second ago. I had it, and now I've lost it. That doesn't matter. There is a species of bird that lives around the Himalaya, all right? Lower elevations, kind of like here, right? About 5,000 feet or so. Doesn't want to be clear up at the top of Mount Everest. Can't tolerate that. But down in the lowlands, all right? These birds survive, they thrive, all right? And it's not one generation, one group of birds laying their eggs and they're completely different. It's multiple generations, all right? And if we forget this honey creeper idea and say right here with this founder species, this is Mount Everest, all right? We got Mount Everest in the middle, and we've got all of this land mass around the mountains, all right? This species of bird can start off on the eastern side of this mountain range, right? And we can start migrating around the mountains, and we could have two groups from this population, right? This initial founding population on the eastern side of the Himalaya, and both of them start migrating in opposite directions, right? They're all the same. They keep flying around generation after generation. Maybe we're 10 or 15 generations later, So 15 years later, we get to the other side, right? And this population that went one way, this population that went the other way, 15 generations later, they come together. They're now completely different species. They are different birds and reproductively incompatible. There is no chance that they could reproduce, even though 15 generations before, when they were all together, they were the same population. They were the same species, right? But as the populations diverge and they each go their separate ways, like I said a second ago, they start accumulating differences, accumulating variation. Mutations happen different in both of these populations, and natural selection acts upon them differently to get to the point that they are different. It's the same as these guys, right? And as we look at each of them with different names, they are different honey creepers. They are different species of honey creepers, right? All originating from something that was a common ancestor, if you will, all right? And they have changed and diverged. And this guy that's feeding on nectar and this one down below feeding on insects could try to mate, but they're not going to produce viable offspring, right? They are different species, right? Crazy. So there are all sorts of possibilities that may set the stage for change, all right? Autopolyploidy is a duplication event that happens in the process of your own cells, where we wind up not separating, not segregating those chromosomes like we should. Oftentimes, that's bad news. When we talk about people, usually in polyploidy events, it's not a good thing, all right? There's usually some sort of genetic anomaly. You might be able to survive it, but oftentimes you are not, all right? So depends on what you're talking about, all right? And like I said, with plants, that might be a little more common. There are other things as well where we can see some polyploidy events, some fish and some lizards, where some of these things have occurred and we see changes, all right? But as we start shifting it up and thinking about mammals, that's a little more of an issue with that. So in this case, with this autopolyploidy, we go from a diploid parent to a tetraploid, a 4-copy instead of 2-copy genome, all right? And part of this stuff, if we think about it a little bit, when we have these events, these polyploidies, if we duplicate, if we wind up with even numbered stuff within the genome, well, that's pretty easy to go through meiosis and take it from an even to an odd, diploid or tetraploid, diploid to haploid, tetraploid to diploid, right? You can split those in half and make those sex cells that will be compatible, right? So this polyploidy offspring that's now 4N, this is its normal character, its normal feature, twice as many copies. And when it makes its sex cells, it goes back to diploid. And at that, the two diploids coming together to make the tetraploid, right? And the diploid offspring of these guys technically can't be breeding with the haploid, not offspring, sex cells, right? The tetraploid sex cells from that can't combine with the diploid sex cells from the other to create something that would be triploid, 3 copies, right? Instead, with plants, there are some variations with that as well, and we can make things that are triploid, right? That almost always in a triploidy event is kind of like the mule, right? You can't separate 3 in half, not very well, not very equally, right? So something that's triploid, usually we think of as being sterile or infertile, a hybrid type of a plant. You can take that seed and plant it, but you can't save those seeds as they have been pollinated because they're not going to be fertile. So from a seed manufacturer standpoint, that's what you kind of want, right? Then you have to always come back to me and buy these seeds. If you want to grow these crops, you always have to come to me because I'm the only one that's got the seeds that are viable. I made it, I manipulated it, and you can plant those saved seeds and nothing will grow, right? Maybe the plant will sprout, but you don't get any seed, you don't get any fruits of your labor in the first place, right? That's kind of crazy, right? So these polyploidy events, the auto, when it just happens naturally, is something that is a pretty common occurrence for plants to have speciation events. Most of us probably eat some bread or other wheat products, and wheat is a polyploidy event. It is a hexaploid, 6 copies of the chromosomes, and 6 you can cut in half, right? Creating new offspring, right? So allopolyploidy, not the auto, not just from not separating right. Allopolyploidy is when we have viable matings between 2 species, right? 2 different things. So species 1, species 2, and we see their gametes, right? Here, a normal gamete, in this case, a polyploid gamete. So something that didn't happen properly. First mating creates some odd characters within this, right? Trying to show some diploids together, these guys, right? And then we get a polyploid gamete and a normal gamete. And as they mate together, now we've got this second mating where we've got numbers that are this new speciation event, right? So it depends. And there are, in this instance, 2 reproductive events that need to occur to get us to this proper amount within there that will lend to some of this variation. So these cichlids, these fish in a lake, a big volcanic lake in Nicaragua, they were originally the same species, right? And over the course of time, not a whole lot of time, right? Over the course of time, they were able to diversify and are technically still in the process of diversifying, right? So there's evidence that they were populated only about a century ago, all right, from a single cichlid fish. And now we see 2 kind of distinct populations, right? So thin and thick-lipped fish, and what they're feeding on is different, right? They've got different types of foodstuffs. They ultimately reproduce with thin-lipped with thin-lipped and thick-lipped with thick-lipped, and it keeps the change occurring with each of these separate, right? That lends to speciation, and technically, we say we're in the midst of this speciation event, all right? There could be potentials when you are early on in these speciation events. There could be potentials that you still get a little bit of intermingling between the 2 different populations, right? But you get to a point where it's no longer a potential for compatibility, right? And it sets the stage really for them to be classified as completely different species, right? There are all sorts of potentials where we might see some organisms that are somewhere in the middle of these speciation events, right? Apples and hawthorns are closely related, all right? Hawthorns produce little fruits that are smaller than a crab apple. They don't taste good at all right? Apples, well, that's a little different, all right? And there's all sorts of variation with apples, thanks to our own preferences and breeding efforts, all right? But the apple and hawthorn, just the 2 wild types, if you will, can live in the same areas of America, all right? the apples that we think about really were coming from Europe in the first place, but that's beside the point. So the apple and hawthorn can be growing in the same area. They could be growing on the same hillside, right? But the timing of when the hawthorn blooms and when the apple blooms are different, right? And it's not really the apples that I'm talking about here or the fruits of the hawthorn. It's some fruit flies, the apple maggot fly. There are two speciation events that we are, or a speciation event, I should say, two species of these maggot flies that we're witnessing occur because of the timing of the blooming of these flowers. One population targeting the hawthorns and another population, the apples, which bloom a little bit later. And so these two types of flies were initially the same fly, but based off of flower preference over the course of time, they have diversified and couldn't reproduce even if you wanted because of the timing, right? And that would be a sympatric because it's in the same area, right? Same hillside. And this is also sympatric, right? Because they're in the same lake, right? The same area. So really pretty interesting. There are other, and I think it's the same fish, cichlids, if I remember right. There are other examples where you can have these fish and they're separated by like, it would be a little bit of geography, I guess, a waterfall. So you've got some that are up above and then this giant waterfall and some that are down below and they can't intermingle. There are some predators that we see below the waterfall, and there are no predators above the waterfall, and the defensive mechanisms that these fish have are different because of selective pressures. No predators versus predators, and it's different. It's more than just thick or thin-lipped that we see here. There are different things that might be driving forces more than just foodstuffs, right? Okay. Do you guys have any questions about that stuff? Does it seem clear? I hope so. Okay. How about my people at home?
I don't have any questions.
Okay, so I'm going to stop. We're going to quit a little bit early. I'm going to stop with that just because the next chapter is short and sweet. And I technically don't want to move the test to Tuesday. You don't want that. We will pick up with the last chapter of material on Tuesday. I hope you guys all have a great weekend. Good day. Trick or treat. That's what you need.
Have a good day.